Racist cops arrest a black man, only to face him in court as the judge presiding over their case. It was a sunny afternoon in a small town where life moved at a slower pace. The streets bustled with the usual rhythm of the day, people shopping, kids playing, and cars rolling by. Among the crowd was Anthony Miles, a sharp-dressed black man in his early 40s. Anthony was a lawyer by trade and a newly appointed judge in the state's circuit court. Known for his intelligence and integrity, he had a reputation for being fair and unwavering in his decisions. But before we dive into what happens next, I'd love to know, where are you tuning in from today? Drop a comment below. Anthony was on his way home from a grocery store, carrying a bag of items he had picked up for dinner. He didn't notice the two police officers parked across the street, their eyes locking on him as he walked to his car. "Hey, what's he doing over here?" one officer muttered to the other. "Doesn't look like he belongs." The officers, Detectives Wilson and Hayes, were notorious in the town for their bias. They had been reprimanded several times for profiling, but somehow managed to hold on to their badges. Today, their attention was fixed on Anthony. They didn't recognize him as the town's newest judge. To them, he was just another black man in a suit, and that was enough. They pulled their squad car next to him, lights flashing. "Excuse me, sir," Wilson said, stepping out. "Mind telling us what you're doing here?" Anthony looked up, surprised but composed. "Is there a problem, officers?" "You tell us," Hayes added, eyeing the grocery bag. "You look suspicious. Got any ID?" Anthony calmly handed over his driver's license, which clearly displayed his name and occupation. But the officers didn't bother to read it. They were already searching for a reason to escalate the situation. "Step away from the car!" Wilson barked. "We need to search it." Anthony frowned. "Search it for what? I haven't done anything wrong." "Refusing to comply, huh?" Hayes said, a smirk forming on his face. "That's resisting." Before Anthony could respond, they grabbed him, pushing him against the car and slapping handcuffs on him. He protested calmly but firmly, but the officers ignored him. They threw him in the back of the squad car and took him to the station, charging him with resisting arrest and obstruction of justice. Anthony spent hours in a holding cell, calmly waiting for his release. He knew the charges wouldn't stick. What the officers didn't realize was that they had just made a grave mistake. A week later, the officers were summoned to court. They were charged with misconduct following a video that surfaced online, showing the entire incident. The clip, captured by a bystander, had gone viral, sparking outrage in the community. The town's residents demanded accountability, and the officers were brought before the court for a preliminary hearing. When the officers walked into the courtroom, they were confident. They had been in situations like this before and always managed to walk away unscathed, but as they took their seats and waited for the judge to enter, an uneasy feeling crept in. "All rise!" the bailiff called out as the door behind the bench opened. The officers stood, their eyes widening in disbelief as Judge Anthony Miles entered the room, dressed in his judicial robes. He strode to the bench with calm authority, his face unreadable as he sat down. "You may be seated," Anthony said, his voice steady. The officers exchanged nervous glances. They recognized him instantly, the man they had arrested just days ago. Their arrogance melted into panic as the realization sank in. Anthony glanced at the case file before addressing the courtroom. "Detectives Wilson and Hayes, you stand accused of misconduct, including racial profiling and unlawful arrest. I believe you're familiar with the incident in question." The officers shifted uncomfortably but remained silent. Anthony leaned forward slightly, his eyes locking on theirs. "You arrested me. Now I am the judge of your case." The room went silent. The officers' faces turned pale as murmurs spread among the spectators. They couldn't believe what was happening. Anthony allowed the weight of his words to hang in the air before continuing. "Justice," he said, his voice firm, "is blind. But clearly, you are not. You judged me by the color of my skin and not by the content of my character. You assumed guilt where there was none. And now you will answer for your actions." The hearing proceeded, and the evidence against the officers piled up. The video showed Anthony complying with every request while the officers escalated the situation unnecessarily. Witnesses testified to the officers' history of targeting minorities, painting a damning picture of their conduct. Anthony remained impartial throughout the proceedings, ensuring the officers received a fair hearing. But his opening statement echoed in their minds, a reminder of their own hypocrisy. In the end, the officers were found guilty of misconduct. They were suspended without pay pending further investigation, and Anthony made it clear that their behavior would not be tolerated in a system meant to uphold justice. As they were escorted out of the courtroom, Wilson and Hayes avoided Anthony's gaze, their arrogance replaced by shame. For the first time, they had been held accountable, and the town's residents hoped it would mark the beginning of change. After the hearing, Anthony removed his robe and stepped outside, where a crowd had gathered. People cheered and applauded him, thanking him for standing up against injustice. Anthony raised a hand to quiet them. "This isn't about me," he said. "It's about fairness. It's about treating every person with dignity, no matter their race, background, or appearance. Today, justice was served, but there is still much work to be done." The crowd nodded in agreement, inspired by his words. Anthony walked away, knowing the fight for equality was far from over, but this was a victory worth celebrating. The courtroom emptied slowly as whispers of the day's events spread through the town. For Anthony Miles, the sense of accomplishment was tempered by the knowledge that systemic change took more than a single courtroom victory. As he walked toward his chambers, a flood of memories rushed through his mind, moments when he too had been judged unfairly, moments that had fueled his drive to study law and eventually don the robe of a judge. But today had been personal in a way he hadn't anticipated. He hadn't set out to teach Wilson and Hayes a lesson. Fate had placed them before him, and he had simply done his duty. Yet he couldn't ignore the symbolic power of what had just happened. Later that evening, as Anthony prepared dinner at home, his phone buzzed incessantly with messages. Friends, colleagues, and strangers from all over were reaching out to congratulate him or share their own stories of facing discrimination. The video of his powerful statement in court, "You arrested me, now I am the judge of your case," was already making waves on social media. News outlets picked it up, framing Anthony as a symbol of justice and accountability. But the attention brought mixed feelings. Anthony wasn't one to seek the spotlight. He preferred to let his work speak for itself. Still, he couldn't deny the impact this moment could have on a broader scale. If his experience inspired others to challenge injustice, then it was worth the discomfort of public scrutiny. Across town, Wilson and Hayes sat in their department's disciplinary review office, their heads hung low. The weight of their actions had finally caught up with them. For years, they had operated with impunity, emboldened by a system that rarely held officers accountable. But now, their arrogance had led them straight into the courtroom of a man they had wronged, a man who had treated them with more fairness than they had shown him. As they awaited the decision on their future in the force, Wilson broke the silence. "How did we not recognize him?" he muttered, shaking his head. Hayes shrugged. "It didn't matter who he was to us. We didn't even care to look. That's the problem." Their conversation drifted into uncomfortable territory as they began to confront their own biases, something they had never done before. The shame of being exposed, not just locally but on a national scale, gnawed at them. They knew they had no one to blame but themselves. In the weeks that followed, the town experienced a shift. The viral nature of the story sparked conversations about racial profiling and policing practices, not just locally but across the state. Activists and community leaders organized town halls where residents shared their stories and demanded reforms. Anthony attended some of these meetings, not as a judge but as a concerned citizen. He listened intently, offering his perspective when asked, but mostly allowing others to speak. He believed in the power of community-driven change and wanted to support the movement without overshadowing it. One evening, as Anthony left a particularly spirited town hall, he was approached by a young black boy and his mother. The boy, no older than 10, looked up at Anthony with wide eyes. "Are you the judge they're talking about on TV?" the boy asked, crouched down to the boy's level, a warm smile spreading across his face. I am. The boy hesitated, then said, I want to be like you when I grow up. Anthony's heart swelled. He placed a hand on the boy's shoulder and said, You can be anything you want to be. Just remember to always stand up for what's right. Meanwhile, the police department underwent significant changes. Wilson and Hayes, facing suspension, were required to attend mandatory training on implicit bias and community relations. The department introduced new policies aimed at increasing transparency and rebuilding trust with the community. While change was slow, it was happening, a testament to the power of accountability. Months later, Anthony presided over a different case, unrelated to Wilson and Hayes, but the courtroom felt different now. There was a heightened awareness in the room, a sense that every decision carried weight not just for the individuals involved, but for the community as a whole. As Anthony banged the gavel to close the proceedings, he glanced at the audience. Among them, he saw Wilson sitting quietly in the back, no longer in uniform. Their eyes met briefly, and Wilson gave a small nod, not of defiance, but of respect. Anthony nodded back. He didn't know if Wilson had truly changed, but he knew this. Justice had the power to transform, not just punish. And that gave him hope for a better future.